One question. I appreciate very much of your many good points, except one. You said, I want to make, let you clear your point. You said China is not a reliable friend of Russia. Is that your point?
Well, not a friend, but a ally. That's different.
Reliable. You say reliable? Not a reliable friend of Russia.
China and Russia are friends forever. That's what I said, in a different manner.
You are diplomatic.
I think we can begin to dissect the distinctions between a friend and an ally, and when an ally is a friend,
and
when
strategic
a friend is an
interests,
ally,
and national and economic interests, and territorial, and history. And we were very bad, like you guys were very bad to China in opium wars. We were not so good in the time of Nicholas II, advancing our interests there too. So, and Chinese people, rightly so, remember that perfectly well, and there are natural desire to restore some of this national pride.
Yusuf Michal?
Now, I've been looking for what is the meaning of security. I mean, what does it mean? What's the actual definition for security? And I found it's just the degree of resistance to or protection from harm. Now, looking at this, who's managing the international security now? This is becoming a very, very hard question to answer. Maybe it was easier 4 weeks ago, before Putin has made a big change with Obama to make him change his mind. Or it was before China became the largest export country in the world. Or before Israel becomes a threat to the whole Middle East. But personally, I believe at this time, really who manages security in the world is groups like Al-Qaeda and like Al-Nusra in Syria, or Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, or Takfir. These are actually the groups that are managing the security because it is in their hand. They can blow and they can change a very secure country, a very secure area, into a big commotion of a country. I don't know, this is for the whole panel. I don't know what you think.
We'll give a go at that. Wolfgang, quickly.
Brilliant discussion. Just one thing, when François began with the notion of Wilhelm II, well, one big issue is the notion of leadership. Doesn't it make change? Didn't we all think about the Obama factor? Didn't we all think about change like that? Secondly, other great point you raised was the Neo-Westphalian. One of the real intricate problems in our international community is that we have a total uneven appreciation of the S word, sovereignty, of the classical principle on which our post-1648 system is based. And finally, as Karl Eikenberry, and I wanted to continue this because Karl and I will discuss afterwards, there are 4 factors, as I always tell my students. They will never change, and they are particularly important now. Factor time, factor cost, and the stakes involved. But all of this changes through the perception. Perception forms reality. And what the perception of the last 4 weeks, that this was rightly mentioned, we are still grappling with this perception for a lot. But these 4 factors are translated into real time, every moment of the world, through media. The power of the media, which gives us now a shortened possibility to have time to react and time to act. And the management of the international system right now is basically only reacting. And we might have to be waiting for those who jump and act.
Christian Lemire.
Thank you, and John, and to the panelists as well. I wanted to pick up on a comment that Dr. Lodhi made on non-interference and the West and the rest. And it seems to me that the rest, and I think particularly of India, China, and Russia, didn't seem to mind the concept of interventionism in 1971 or in 1979 or in 2008. So I wonder whether actually your comment that the West is aligning itself with the rest on the concept of interventionism is maybe temporarily correct, but in the long term it's more likely the rest will align itself with the West, particularly as their overseas interests develop and their capabilities to intervene also increase as well.
Then in the very back row, gentleman in the back, yes?
My name is Christopher Peters from the Good Governance Group in London. Igor Yurgens speaks a lot of good things, but I do think it's a shame that you repeat this Russian mantra that Helmut Kohl said that NATO would never expand. I lived in Russia for 10 years. I heard that that was said by Helmut Kohl, by George Bush Sr., by James Baker, and that it was said to Mr. Gorbachev and to Mr. Shevardnadze, but no one can quite identify when exactly it was said. Furthermore, if it was said, first of all, I think
I didn't hear.
They were, Bush or Kohl or Baker was speaking on behalf of one nation, not of NATO. And secondly, a lot changed. The Soviet Union collapsed into 15 countries, conflict in Georgia, conflict in Moldova, conflict in Azerbaijan. Yugoslavia fell apart. So, you know, I think you'd maybe do a disservice by repeating that mantra.
No, I can't, but I think you're essentially questioning this presumption as to whether the promises made were the promises that Russia thought were made.
I just think it's maybe sad that that's repeated so often in Russia. I think on the whole, you say very, very many good things.
Got it. Mr. Baldessari? Yeah.
Thank you, John. If we rely on economic theory, we have a very quick and very old answer about security. Security, since 200 years ago, is a public good, and the public good cannot be produced but by the state. Now let's shift into political science and social consideration. Where is the state in this multipolar world? We have some kind of state in the world coming from the bipolar world, the previous one, which is the G8, which is the Security Council with the veto and so on. But where is the new state in the world able to face and produce this public good, which is security, in a multipolar world? So we need a new G8, we need a new Security Council. Can we imagine a UN assembly where the majority of countries ask for democracy within the UN assembly, but they don't ask for democracy within their own countries?
Thank you very much. There's a few other people who want to intervene, but let me just pause it there. I'm going to ask people to respond in this order. Igor Yurgens, then François Heisbourg, then Ellen Laipson, and then Maleeha Lodhi. And the reason I'm doing that is I have a question for Ellen and Maleeha, and I want to give them a little bit more chance to think about it. For Maleeha, the question I'll put to you is that you said in your remarks that the people in the South, and by implication also you said the governments in the South are wedded to the idea of non-interference in internal affairs of other states, and this is something that the Westerners do and others don't do. But if you speak to states in the GCC, they think Iran involves itself in the internal affairs in the GCC. If you speak to parliamentarians in Chile, they would say that Venezuela involves itself in the internal affairs of Chile. And I could cite a number of other examples. Some of them would be awkward, but the reality is that many states of the South intervene very regularly in the internal affairs of their neighbors, whether they're in their own near abroad or far away. If you are looking at even the foreign policies of proxy actors, Hezbollah is not active only in Iran's near abroad. There are other places where they're awkward as well. So this safe presumption that the South never interferes in the internal affairs of other countries, let alone other southern countries, is that really A, correct, and B, a trend that can be forecast for the future? And for Ellen, the question I want to ask is you I think, properly reflected the conventional wisdom of the US foreign policy establishment that economic revival is a conditioned precedent for the return of productive and constructive extroversion in US foreign policy. But a generation on from the people who fought the Cold War and people who managed with the immediate Cold War structure would not greater economic wealth and autonomy in the United States, the satisfaction that the American economic ecosystem was working very well, not encourage even more the forces of isolationism that we have seen crop up in the Democrat Party and in the Republican Party as well. So rather like while people like you, who are exponents of perhaps the foreign policy mainstream, will say economic revival will allow us to become extroverts, won't the majority of the American people perhaps think that economic revival permits introversion? Igor Yurgens first.
Well, I guess one of the questions which was sort of giving an answer to which I can illuminate and give an example of why we are sort of insecure is this exactly the NATO advance. I talked to Mr. Gorbachev. He told me personally in the presence of some other people that yes, Helmut Kohl promised that as soon as we get out of GDR, no NATO advance will take place infrastructurally. Then some people say, okay, Solana confirmed it also in one of the conversations that it took place, but it was an oral agreement. They couldn't, you know, put these words on paper. So the events after that changed the picture. So then I came back to Mr. Gorbachev, with whom I worked during Perestroika, and asked, Mr. Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, why didn't you put it on paper? He said, are you crazy? It was 1989, Honecker was still alive, all my allies in the Warsaw Pact were still alive, and I would put it on paper that I'm getting out of GDR and there will be no advance in return? It's crazy, I couldn't do that. So anyway, long story short, a number of Russians in high positions, Soviets and then Russians, were promised that there will be no advance. Advance took place, legitimately so, because the people of Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania demanded NATO to advance. So what can we do? But nevertheless, this insecurity I described to you took place once and for all, and then Mr. Putin tried to reset with NATO when he came back, and he was not as Soviet as, for example, Yeltsin was, and he gave away Lourdes base in Cuba, expecting something back. Nothing happened. And there was a tacit agreement between Mr. Bush and Mr. Putin that something will happen if we give away Lourdes base in Cuba, which was eavesdropping the whole of the territory of the United States and more. Then he gave Kamran base, he closed it down, and Kamran base allowed Russians to control the whole maritime circulation in those seas. He was expecting something base in terms of non-advance of NATO infrastructure. He didn't receive anything back. And so on and so forth. I can tell you about September 11th, his first call to Mr. Bush saying, take this Kyrgyzia and everything else and you know, for the transit purposes and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, the other day, Brent Scowcroft was telling me personally that, you know, we never promised to you that we will retreat when the acute stage is over. Wait a minute, this is simply not true. And so on and so forth. So all I'm saying is that Mr. Yeltsin, Mr. Putin, Mr. Lavrov, and others in this ruling elite of Russian Federation have a list of grievances to NATO, which are real, which are factual and not whimsical.
Thank you. François Heisbourg.
Yeah, a few quick points and answers. First, the leadership question, which was posed by a friend, Dansbeck Gruber. Yes, we complain about the lack of leadership. That is very largely, I think, a function of age. It always looks better in the past somehow. But more seriously, if our electorates don't want to be led, they will presumably elect people who will tend to be weak leaders. This will not be a reflection on the weakness of the character of these people. You know, take the extreme example, of course, is Germany. Mrs. Merkel was not elected to be a leader in the sense that George W. Bush, for example, was elected to be a leader, for better or for worse. And in that case, of course, for worse. And if we have the impression that there is weak leadership in a number of capitals these days, I think it is largely due to the fact that this is actually what the electorates tended to want, which is why I do consider that the weakening of the West is not simply the mechanical effect of the changing forces in the world, but it's also something about the weakening of the will of the West to play the same role as it traditionally has. Question put by, a remark made by Igor Yurgens, and I agree with him that we should think strategically about trade issues. Yes, TTIP and TPP are strategic issues. And many people understand that, including in trade circles. It's interesting. Even in the European Union, some people understand that, strange as it may sound, which is not a place which usually thinks strategically. And of course, this is also a reflection on the weakness of the WTO. And if we didn't get Doha, this is neither the fault of the West, specifically, or of Russia, or of the BRICS. It was rather more the systemic nature of the decision-making processes in that body. But it does not flow from that as soon as you have a trader, you have a crusader. And most of the wars of the 20th century had nothing to do with trade, or very little to do with trade. The crusaders were tended to be driven by other motives. And simply, we should think strategically, but we should not assume that A, this leads to war, and B, that this is unnatural. Of course, China and the US and other countries will continue to vie for influence. This is natural. Human beings do that. We do it amongst ourselves, in the workplace, everywhere. Doesn't mean we kill each other. At least it shouldn't. So, you know, I'm not worried that trade is part of strategy. But I agree that we should think about it strategic. Third thing, we always talk, and rightly so, about the UN Security Council, the cornerstone, patati patata. I agree. But we should think much more about the UN system. Because when we look at the security challenges, and not simply in preventive terms, sometimes actually in crisis management terms, it's not the Security Council which is front player. I take a practical example, the SARS epidemic in 2003. A very interesting case. A UN agency takes the lead, WHO, Madame Brundtland from Norway. She works with concerned states. She works with concerned municipalities. She works with airports. She works with health authorities, private and public. A very good example of pulling together the state and the non-state. And all of this in a crisis mode. Very, very interesting. And of course, if she had not succeeded, this would have become a security issue of the very first order, including in terms of the use of force. She managed to limit the death toll to around 1,000, instead of there being millions. This is the way the new world should also be thought about. As for the Security Council, there's a bit of a question, a mystery, which I pose myself. Article 51 is very rarely invoked. If I were determined, as a Frenchman, to want to intervene militarily in Syria, I don't have to go to the Security Council. I say, I have recognized the Free Syrian government, and they have written me a letter invoking Article 51 of the Charter. And we could go in. Not that I would find it a very good idea. Now, Maleeha is saying, this is what we did at Mali. Everybody congratulates us on Mali. We've heard the congratulations all day from Sergei Ivanov, from everybody. And I love these congratulations. But this is what happened during the night. We sort of told the relevant Malian interim authorities how you draft the Article 51 letter. That's how we intervened. We didn't go to Security Council. We went afterwards, and it was not a formal decision of the Security Council. So this is a wild card which is rarely played, but it's one that we should keep in mind more than we do. Just a word on the state. I'm a Frenchman. I am very scared when I see the state divesting itself progressively of its core competences in the field of security. And this is happening all over. Private military companies, private security militias, and so on. That, to me, is what may delegitimize the most the state as a player in the future international system. And that would really bring us back to the Middle Ages, because that's the way it was done during the Middle Ages. It was even done that way in the early days of colonization. And just back to Dunschbeck-Gruber, you know, we shouldn't be reactive. Well, the IISS has been created to be proactive. That's what we're doing here. Thank you.
Ellen Laipson.
So, John, you've asked me whether an economic revival in the U.S. would actually strengthen the forces of isolation. I think we'll always have a provincialism in parts of the United States. We'll always have some people who think we don't need to be the global actor. And I think we see this more strongly in the Republican Party with the rise of the Tea Party than in the Democratic Party. So right now, part of the Democratic Party thinks we should curtail our foreign obligations in the interest of strengthening ourselves at home. But I am resisting the logic of your question, because I don't think the economic revival can be divorced from globalization. I think that the strengthening of industry in the U.S. is about a global market. It's not about selling just to Americans. I hear in your question the prospect of greater energy independence in the United States, and whether that changes the psychology of how the United States sees its role in the world and economic interdependence with people who are less energy secure. And I have two thoughts. One is, I am a little startled at how everybody is racing to this great enthusiasm about the prospects of energy independence without the normal checks and balances of what are the possible costs and consequences of fracking. I don't understand why the environmentalists haven't made more noise yet about, and I think we don't know. We have to wait until this plays out a bit. But there is a lot of enthusiasm that energy independence will somehow make us less obliged to have close relations with Saudi Arabia. I think some of these arguments are, to me, they're not realistic. I think that the United States, so long as we are still one of the great powers of the world, will have a deep interest in the stability of energy security of most of the world, and that we have a security obligation to those countries that will not go away overnight. So it may play out over time in the way you've described, but I do think the economic revival depends on us being interconnected, looking for larger markets beyond the United States. And the energy independence thing, I think, is sometimes a bit overstated. I actually am uncomfortable when people use energy independence, the prospect of energy independence, as an argument for withdrawing from the Middle East, because I think our interests there are multiple. They are not exclusively about energy.
Thank you very much. Actually, the most cunning argument I ever heard from a member of the foreign policy establishment on this very point, in an attempt to reassure people in the Middle East that the United States was not abandoning its interests in the Middle East because of the prospect of energy independence, which is nearly now in any case realized, is actually the rebalance to Asia requires us to be very engaged in the Middle East, because to reassure our Asian partners, Republic of Korea, India, and Japan, who are hugely dependent on Middle East energy resources, we have to be able to provide security for Middle East energy resources. So this was the cunning foreign policy establishment argument. How that falls in the lap of general public opinion in the United States, I don't think, but there is an answer to that question that I've heard quite often. I hope friends of the United States in the Middle East are comforted by that. Maleeha Lodhi, no one in the South intervenes in anyone else in the South. Do you disagree, or would you be able to refine your comment on that?
I think you misunderstood and confused two separate points that I was making. First of all, I made the broad point that we have no option but to move towards, in this very, very complicated world, where actually no single power can achieve any outcome. We've seen that. We've seen that in Iraq, and we've seen that in Afghanistan. The point that I was making was that such a rule-based system must rest on several pillars, and I was identifying some of those pillars, of which I said non-interference to many people like me would have to be a very essential principle. But separately, I made the point, and what has struck me over the last several weeks, actually, and I'm struck in a very pleasant way, in a very positive way, at the way public opinion has placed limits on what, for example, your Prime Minister could do, which is to support military action and get involved in military action in Syria, and the way the American public has responded to the call for military action in Syria without UN authorization. I was struck because I feel that opinion aligns, now I'm talking about public opinion, aligns it with public opinion in much of the rest, perhaps not all of the rest. And I'm not talking about elites here. I'm talking about public opinion in countries like yours and public opinion in countries like mine. The difference is that we were already there, in the sense that public opinion sought to limit the actions of elites, even in our part of the world, to resort to military action of different kinds, whether through proxies or directly. So what I'm finding very interesting is that you see a congealing of opinion. It may be a fleeting moment, or it may amount to something, and that's where leadership comes in. So the question actually I posed at the end was, does this fleeting, transient, if it is transient, moment, where publics are saying, sorry, we saw you do what you did in Iraq, we didn't like it. We saw you do what you did in Afghanistan, and frankly, it didn't really produce what you said it would. In fact, we don't know what it produced. Now, as a neighbor of Afghanistan, I can tell you that people in my part of the world only saw military intervention bringing grief to the people of that region, and I think to the people of America too, who lost lives. And also, I think these wars had much to do with America's financial problems. I mean, we know that American power dissipated partly as a result of these wars and partly as a result of the fiscal impact or the financial impact, and the fact that it lost its moral legitimacy. Now, all of that is producing a certain reaction. And it was that reaction that I was pointing to, and I was saying, and I was wondering, and maybe in a very idealistic way, and I think it's good to be idealistic, that is it possible then for elites to respond to this public opinion and say, yes, we will not act alone, and we will not act outside international law, and we will not act without UN authorization. I think these are principles which, I would subscribe to, and I would hope that elites in the West would subscribe to, because it seems that their public are pointing in that direction. I mean, I was struck, last point, by one particular opinion poll. I forget which one it is. It's not the one you quoted, Francois, yesterday. It's not a Pew poll, but there were so many polls in the United States, Ellen, you might remember, where people were asked, would you support military action without UN authorization? It's a very interesting question. And the numbers are very, very high on that, because people seem to understand the connection, which is you're acting outside what the international system provides. So to me, I was very excited by this answer, because I think it echoes what a lot of us in the rest of the world feel about military intervention. I think the era of large-scale military interventions, I hope, is over, and that we can return to new forms of multilateralism. Perhaps we need to democratize these forms of multilateralism. Democratizing the UN is an old issue, but it's something that needs to be revisited. And finally, I would say to the gentleman who talked about security, you're absolutely right. Security is conceived and viewed differently in different parts of the world. More people die of poverty in my part of the world than they do through drone strikes, even though we don't like drone strikes. So, it depends on where you are situated. So security means different things to different people. And I think a very heroic effort was made by a high-level panel that the United Nations Secretary General had appointed, which looked at these cluster of threats. And it was a very complex picture. So the threats are not just what the people or elites in the West conceive of as threats. I mean, we confront different kinds of security threats. Thank you.
Maleeha, thank you very much. We've had a lot of food for thought, an awful lot of thought for food, perhaps, now then. So I invite you all, please, to give our 4 panelists a standing ovation as you go and have dinner. Thank you very much.